For those of us who are joining us for the first time, allow me to introduce you to Khidki or the Khidki Collective, literally a window into the world. Khidki seeks to offer perspectives through multiple vantage points, a collective that came into existence with the second wave of the pandemic as a series of conversations on how people related to the idea of the Deccan. The emphasis on the collective comes from a set of practices, the first being writing and translating academic insights into widely accessible knowledge. The second being a practice to think about places, regions, and their historical trajectories, starting with the Deccan as a place that cannot be drawn into nationalist or statist agendas and therefore holds possibilities of creative work. And finally and critically, a practice to collaborate, learn, develop the same from other places and regions. So Malabar, Bundelkhand, Punjab, only to name a few. What we'll do is we'll place a link in the chat box of Kirti's website where you can access all the articles that have so far been written in one place. The first set of articles by Kirti's writers were published in the News Minute. The current set of articles are rolling out in the Wire. This is Khidki's first book conversation. I am pleased to invite Aisha Mola, PhD candidate at Shiv Nadar University at the Department of Sociology with interest in food practices of Deccan. She explores the history of Muslim belonging in Hyderabad through food and Hyderabad's culinary past. Dr. Nazia Akhtar, as you know, is the author of Bibi's Room. As we're discussing this, please note her book is out. It's published by Orient Black Swan. She is an assistant professor at IIT Hyderabad and, as evident in the title of her book, works on literature and history of Hyderabad, women's writing, and comparative literature. So over to Aisha Mola and Nazia Akhtar.
Thank you so much for the introduction. And I want to begin by thanking the Khidki Collective for this opportunity. I'm very, very thrilled and honored to actually be in conversation with Dr. Nazia Akhtar for her new book. So before I begin, I just want to also mention that Dr. Nazia Akhtar, amongst her many accomplishments, also include being awarded the New India Foundation Fellowship in 2017 to write a book on Urdu prose by Hyderabadi women, which is the book that we are discussing today, Bibi's Room. And it went into print in July 2022. So it's one of those products of a pandemic delay, but we are very happy that it's finally here with us. Amongst many projects that Dr. Nazia Akhtar is taking up, she's also translating the works of several other women writers from the region, from Urdu into English. These are projects that we are all eagerly waiting and looking forward to. So thank you so much, Dr. Nazia, for joining us today. I've had the privilege of reading the book for the purpose of this conversation, and I'm just going to hold up the book for the audience to see. The Bibi's Room, Hyderabadi Women, and 20th Century Urdu Prose. I would urge everyone in the audience today to please get a copy of the book and read Dr. Akhtar's excellent scholarship, because it furthers debates on the region and furthers debates on the contribution of writers from Hyderabad, especially women writers from the region. So I will just briefly introduce the book, and then I'm going to pose some questions to Dr. Akhtar and probably start a conversation. Right? So Bibi's Room studies the lives and the literary contributions of 3 women writers from Hyderabad who wrote in Urdu. We start with Zeenat Sajida Begum, then with Najma Nikhat Sahiba, and with Jilani Bano Sahiba. Each chapter in the book contains translated works that have been translated by the author herself, and with detailed biographies of the writers that delves into the philosophies, into their philosophies and the process of writing, or the socio-cultural context in which they were situated when they were writing. It also talks about their contributions to different social political movements in the region. The interesting things about each chapter is that it also comes with thematic analysis of the oeuvre or the body of work that each of these authors had, the collection of essays, published, unpublished, that Dr. Nazia Akhtar very brilliantly analyzes for us and brings it in the form of this book. Gender plays an important theme, important role. Most protagonists are women. Their writings also provide critiques of social structures, social inequalities, of feudal practices, patriarchy. There is in very interesting literary forms that are deployed throughout the works of these very prolific women writers that Dr. Nazia is looking at in this book. So with Dr. Nazia's permission, if I can please begin and ask you your first question slash comment that you could respond, and we can start our conversation.
Yes, of course. Thank you. Thank you for that, Aisha. Thank you for that introduction. And thank you also to Vanshika. I just want to point out one thing. I'm at Triple IT Hyderabad, not at IIT Hyderabad. It's a very common error. So yeah. Yes, go ahead, Aisha.
Great. All right. So I'm coming back to the book, the introduction, all the chapters, I think were a it was very interesting to read and see how you further a lot of debates that we are grappling with as scholars, studying Deccan, studying Hyderabad. And the first thing that really came to my mind was when you talk about triple marginalization in the introduction, right? This triple invisibilization, if I may say, of literary scholarship that was coming from this region. So invisibilization that is regional, because a lot of scholars do not tend to talk about writers from Deccan, the way in which there has been an emphasis on writers from the north, particularly in the histories of the progressive writers movement. But this neglect is also gendered, that even if there is any mention of the writers from Deccan, which and there are exceptions. You do talk about Aziz Ahmad Sahab's Taraqi Pasand Adab, Rakshanda Jalil's work, which showcased the work of Makhdoom Mohyuddin Sahab, Qazi Abdul Ghaffar, Mohyuddin Qadri Zor, Sibte Hassan. But there isn't a full-fledged analysis of the progressive writers movement in the specific social, political, linguistic context of Hyderabad, and it still remains sort of still remains neglected. And even if there is a mention of the writers and poets of the region, women writers don't seem to find a place in this discussion on literary canons. And very rightly you point out, it's not that the women writers were not visible in Deccan. They were very much celebrated. They were very much visible. Some even enjoyed stardom in Hyderabad and also in other parts of the subcontinent. So why this research gap that is both regional and gendered? And you also come to a third point, which is this neglect that is further exacerbated by the neglect of princely states in general, right? Where the British Raj is the upholder of social reform and women's education and progress and change, whereas there has been, of course, there is a lot of scholarship on it. You're borrowing from a lot of other work that's been done in other princely states. But how do we end up also neglecting the contributions, literary and cultural contributions of princely states? So yeah, this is my first comment / question that you really brilliantly bring out in your introduction. So please tell us more.
Okay, so I think of this as concentric circles of marginalization. I think that's a useful visualization of this problem. So like you said, so there are three things at work. First is language itself, right, and the regional aspect of language. So we tend to think that Urdu is a northern phenomenon, which is ironic, given the fact that Urdu literature, flowered and, was nurtured and sustained in the Deccan before it went north and became the courtly language and received the patronage, that it later got at the courts of Delhi and Lucknow. So there's that aspect, that there is in most Urdu and English language literary historiographies that you find of Urdu, the Deccan is not even a footnote, with the exception of, apart from, of course, Rakshanda Jalil's work and Aziz Ahmad's work on the progressive writers, where they talk about Makhdoom, Rakshanda Jalil does an excellent job in one chapter where she talks about the All India Progressive Writers conference that took place in 1945, which kind of, restores which kind of brings these Hyderabadi figures and, the unique geography of Hyderabad as a cultural center of Urdu into the historiography of the progressive writers movement. You have that. You also have Anne-Marie Schimel's excellent chapter in her book Classical Urdu Literature from the Beginnings to Iqbal, where she does a proper analysis and gives us names and contexts of the various Dakhani poets. But for historical reasons, I mean, you asked why is there this research gap? For historical reasons, Dakhani has not been given, and not only Dakhani, but then by association, writers and poets writing in quote unquote Urdu. And this idea of Urdu itself is problematic and not a given. So I'm going to put it within double inverted quotes. Are kind of automatically neglected and ignored. So there's nothing happening in Urdu south of Bhopal. So that's the first thing. And the second thing is this, durable kind of stereotype of the princely states as, these static, timeless, Orientalist fantasies presided over by medieval despots. Which is a creation of the colonial historian, right? And because it was, it's a self-serving assertion, because the idea was to portray the British Raj and British India as as the progressive, as the sites of reform and progress. So there is a neglect of the society and culture of the princely states. And of course, even within Urdu historiography, even within Urdu literary historiography, whether in English language research or in Urdu language research, women are not there, right? Even in Jalil's work or Aziz Ahmed's work, there is no mention of women writers or progressive writers. I think Jalil mentions in Liking Progress, Loving Change, her kind of excellent history of the progressive writers movement. She mentions Bajida Tabassum at one point, when it comes to women who were associated with Hyderabad and writing about Hyderabad, whether in Hyderabad or elsewhere. And I mean, I was having I think Sara Waheed is here. She may want to, I think she wanted to speak at some point, so we should bring her in on this. But we were having a conversation a few weeks ago, and Sara said that just because all these male poets and writers stopped writing, right? The progressive writers, doesn't mean that everyone stopped. There were all these women writers who were writing. I mean, Najma Nikhat, whom I've talked about in this book, I have a chapter on her, was a progressive, kind of devoted and committed progressive till the day she died in 1997. So even within scholarship that talks about the Deccan, women are absent. So there are all of these circles within circles within circles. So yeah.
So that's true. And your work sort of gives a new line of inquiry into, the literary, the social, the cultural aspects of the princely states, and especially of the 20th century, and displaces this hegemony of the North in scholarship on Urdu literature. All right. My next sort of question and comment of sorts is about the title, which I find very interesting, is where you use Hyderabadi women, right? And how you define Hyderabadi women. Because it is very crucial to furthering our scholarship on Deccan, on Hyderabad, is how we define Hyderabad. And very often, and I'm actually going to borrow heavily from one of the discussions that we had as part of Goal Maze, which the Hyderabad Urban Lab and Khirki Collective organized sometime last year with Dr. Khadija Khadir, who's also present here, where I think she very eloquently said that we don't necessarily, a lot of the frames that we have that exist, for instance, hybridity or liminality or multiculturalism, many times these things may not necessarily be enough to encapsulate what it is to be Hyderabadi, especially with her work being on Hadramis and the idea of having multiple loyalties, multiple affinities, multiple homelands, so whether you're Marwari, whether you're Hadrami Chaush or a Hindustani in Hyderabad, how, it is very much in the nature of the way Deccan is established or Dakkani is established, that sort of accommodates these multiplicities, right?
Right.
And I really found the way you define Hyderabadi women very interesting, which sort of really furthers this conversation, furthers the debates on mulki, ghair mulki, and so on. So, and at one point, you also mentioned that Hyderabad is just not a city, right? It's not just a princely state, but it also has the conceptual contours of a region, right? And it also sort of, because it's situated in these porous demographics, linguistic, social, cultural horizons that include a lot of different parts. So tell us a little more about the title and how you came up with the idea of who is Hyderabadi or what constitutes being Hyderabadi women particularly.
Right. So, okay. So I think this was, I knew that this would be, something that I would have to tackle conceptually, methodologically, because of that history of the mulki, non-mulki, debates, as well as, the long history of migration upon migration, right, which this region has seen. It's not only, I would not just say, there are so many different starting points, right, to this particular question that you can take. In some sense, this kind of mimics a palimpsest, right? Because there is kind of story upon story of migration. So you can take your, for instance, one point of departure can be, Salar Jung's specific policy of encouraging migration, right? Which of course leads to these questions of these tensions of mulki, non-mulki and all of that. And I'm not going to kind of use that category too much, because I think that was that came specifically from a context of class conflict between the upper class, between the nobles and these kind of new middle class migrants who came from elsewhere, the ghair mulkis, and who were seen as a threat, right? Because they brought with them all of a sudden, your place in the social and political and other hierarchies of Hyderabad came to be defined not by nobility and by your by your birth or your closeness to power, but by skills and training, right? So there's that one moment, and you have these men migrating and moving. They bring their families with them. They have families here. They marry women here. Later on, of course, there are also women migrants who come specifically for work and things like that. You have that, but even before that, there's a long history of migration into this region, right? Being the cultural, economic, prosperous center that it was, and so on. And so I knew that I had to kind of tackle this. What is and there have been so many, partitions since then. There's been, the Qutub Shahi kingdom later becoming an Asaf Jahi kingdom is not what I would call a partition. But if you think of what happens after 48, right, when Hyderabad is split, when the Telangana districts go into Andhra, and the Kannada speaking districts go into Karnataka, and the Marathi speaking districts go into Bombay province, which becomes Maharashtra. So that, and then you have, of course, the creation of Telangana out of Andhra and so on. So I think that at what stage, what definition do I then use for, when I'm talking about Hyderabadi women? Because a lot of this is happening most of this is happening in the 20th century. I'm not talking about the Salar Jung period. And so, that had to be defined. And so, I was comforted by the fact that I was not the only person who was dealing with this, and that, other people like the worthy scholars who wrote that book called Womanscape, which is so it's Vasant Kannabiran, Kalpana Kannabiran, and Volga, who put together this profile of 100 women from Andhra. But then, they again, and this is pre-Telangana Andhra. So, what do you define as an Andhra woman, right? So, so it was, I think, so yes, and I've deliberately kept that category very flexible and amorphous for the simple reason that you can't have very narrow definitions of regional belonging or linguistic or religious or cultural belonging when you have a public sphere that is informed by, by the politics, culture, society of this porous region, right? Of this very porous region. And you also pointed out that thing about, Hyderabad not just being a city. This is, I mean, it's so freak. This slippage is so common. I mean, when we talk about princely Hyderabad state, we usually end up talking about Hyderabad city. This is also one reason why I chose these particular writers, because their stories, their own histories, of course, go beyond the city itself. Zinat Sajida, for instance, belonged to Gulbarga, right? And her roots in Gulbarga, in the Sufi traditions of Gulbarga, remained very strong. Najma Nikhat lived, in small villages across Andhra and Telangana. And Jilani Bano, of course, comes from Badayun, which is, in UP. And so there's that constant tension between Hindustani and Hyderabadi and Dakkani and all of that. So I'm not sure if I've captured everything. If there's anything else you want me to touch on, I've kind of given a very broad kind of response to this. Maybe if people have questions about this, it'll come out a little more later.
You do. In fact, in the chapter on Jilani Banu Sahiba, you mention this in-betweenness that she experiences when she goes back home to, she and her family experience when they go back home to Badayun. Because in Badayun, they are Hyderabadis, and when they're back home in Hyderabad, they are Hindustanis. So this constant in-betweenness that is experienced by people for having multiple affinities and yet belonging to the region.
Right. So this, if I can just add one more thing, I also found it useful. I mean, this is something that I spoke about in the book. I found it useful because, see, there are a couple of things. First, very few of the women whom I have worked on in terms of their writing, right, whose writings I have kind of read, have ever felt the need to assert their Hyderabadi identity. So this is also a speculative exercise on my part, but I've also found it useful in the larger kind of framework of this research when I'm meeting people or talking to people or reading other kinds of things. I found it useful to just see what people say when you ask them, "Are you a Hyderabadi?" And I think that response tells you a lot about how they define Hyderabadiness. I mean, on one hand, you have people who will, intuitively say yes because they've been here for so long. I mean, their regional roots are so deep by, in terms of time, just the kind of longevity of their time here, that it's almost intuitive. And their, previous ties have been severed or do not remain in the same in the same kind of way. I mean, you could have a very strong Hadrami or kind of identity, for instance, but I mean you're still rooted here. That's one group. And the other group, which I find so interesting, is people who very thoughtfully say that yes, they're Hyderabadi, and they associate that with a strong sense of a kind of plural ethos, which they, a kind of, I mean, there are debates about whether you can talk about syncretism or, a Dakkani synthesis. Karen Leonard, for instance, I know has had problems with this term, but, so you have this, it's very strongly associated with this idea of a syncretic culture, which revolves around language, right? A very strong linguistic identity converging on Dakkani, as well as other things like tangible heritage, right? So yeah, so I've taken up a lot of time. Go ahead.
No, but if you want to say some more, you can, or else I can jump into the next part of the talk.
I think, yeah, go ahead. I think this, if there's anything I've left out, I'm sure it'll come out in the questions that people ask. So yeah.
Okay, so the next question that I had, which was very difficult for me because it's a challenge to understand literary forms because I'm not trained in that. But as someone who's training in social anthropology, and who's being trained to look at the social or the political, what I found very interesting is how do we locate the social and in the literary forms that are deployed by these very prolific women writers that you are looking at. So, for example, the use of tanzia, tanzo mizah, which is humor or satire, as a literary expression in Zinat Sajida Sahiba's work, and also the use of Begum Ti Zaban, the Begum's tongue or a dialect, which sort of emerges in Najma Nikhat Sahiba's work, especially in her short stories depicting the lives of women in these feudal dowries. So tell us a little about the literary forms that we use that sort of bring out for us the social, political context in which they are writing this.
Right. So that's a very interesting question. So you're basically, when you say literary form, I think you're asking about genre, right? The role of genre and the ways in which women deploy genre for their own kind of specific purposes. Yes, I mean, I'm endlessly fascinated by the way Zinat Sajida, for instance, uses inshaya. And let me take another example of Jilani Bano and the way she uses the novel form, right, to kind of with spectacular success to achieve the ends that she wants to achieve. Begamati Zuban is a slightly, okay, it's not a genre question, but let me come back to it a little later. Zinat Sajida, I found something so fascinating about her that on one hand, she wrote these deeply sentimental, romantic stories, right? I mean, there are these short stories which are, in the very standard, almost cliched kind of mold, which are very beautiful in their own, in their own right. But this is not where I think her, and you can see her skill as a writer. You can kind of see her skill as, as someone who wields language in these stories. But I think the true power of her writing lies in her essays, lies in that Tanzomiza, lies in her Hake, which is pen portraits of, famous people she knew that she wrote. The Inshaya is a light sketch. So it's not supposed to be used for very heavy, very heavy topics, or things that are serious, or serious philosophical questions. It's meant to be, for instance, she writes a wonderful inshaya on the summer, the pleasures of the summer in Hyderabad. She lists various kinds of mangoes and so on. But there are, I mean, the essays that are most fascinating and I think most powerful and most radical are ones like Agar Allah Miyan Aurat Hote, which has been translated in this book, If Allah Miyan Were a Woman. And there's another one called, which is the one on राह में अभी तो राह में है संग गिरा और हम हैं तो अभी राह में है संग गिरा और, which means, as long as we exist there will be obstacles in our path, which is where the title of this book, Bibi's Room, comes from, because she's talking about the kind of mental load of women. And I think following from Virginia Woolf, calling for, the need to give women time and space, not only literally, but within the literary tradition, right? For them to achieve their full creative potential, right? To expand the literary tradition to make space for these women. And if you read Agar Allah Miyan Aurat Hote, I'm sure if she had chosen a more serious tone for this discussion rather than a very light-hearted, I'm just asking, I just ask, what if Allah Miyan were a woman? Instead of, if she had chosen to make it very serious and a very serious philosophical inquiry, a very serious analysis of exegesis, or, or let's say, commentaries on the Quran or the Hadith, it's possible that it could have been very controversial. It's possible that it would not have been, that she would not have been able to say that the things that she's able to say about God, prophet, and believer, that she gets away with, by saying, oh, I'm just, playing around with this idea in my head. Jilani Bano manages to use, I have always marveled at how her novels have not received the attention that they rightfully deserve, even though they've won national and international awards. But, she's someone who has used the novel to do what I think historiography was not able to do for a very long time. I think one of the finest documentations as well as analyses and interventions into historiography, where the transfer of power is concerned, is Evan Ghazal. Where she really uses the span that a novel allows you to, the narrative arc that you can get in a novel, because you can write a lot and you can really expand and develop characters and scenarios and background and setting to say things and to make claims and take positions about what happened in Hyderabad. I mean, it's a text which blurs the boundaries between fiction and historiography in a way where you cannot simply say that this is a novel or this is entirely fiction, right? Her Barishe Sang, A Hail of Stones, is, I think, one of the finest analyses of class and gender, and particularly in the context of the agrarian struggle, the peasant struggle in Telangana. So yeah, and to come to your question about Begamati Zuban. So for those who may not know, Begamati Zuban is a specific kind of language that women spoke in the zenanas of Delhi, Lucknow, Hyderabad. I'm sure there must be a zenana, Begamati Zuban in Bhopal as well. But we do know of, I think the ones that are reasonably well documented are the ones in the north. There hasn't been a lot of research on the Begamati Zuban of Hyderabad. And what is so interesting about Begamati Zuban is it's a language that women, it's very earthy, it's very piquant, it's full of, very suggestive language. It's full of slang, it's very tangy, there are a lot of references to gendered experiences. I mean, a lot of the figurative vocabulary comes from gendered experiences like menstruation, like childbirth, like pregnancy. And this is the language that women spoke among themselves in the Zenana. And these were not things that they could say to men. And when they wanted to speak amongst themselves, it's also, I think, it shows, and Gail Minot is someone who's done a very good job of talking about this in the context of Delhi Begamati Zuban, is that this is, characteristic of the Zenana, of women who were not very highly educated at a particular time, who, met and interacted with people from women from a wide cross section of society. So, Zenana women still had, still worked very closely with their working class mates. They interacted with working class women vendors, for instance. So their language is informed by all these interactions. And this is why the reformers were so keen to, because they saw this as decadent, bad, an example of women's backwardness and, what was ailing Muslims in particular and Muslim society, and what was standing in its way. And they were very threatened by this quote unquote contaminating influence, contaminating interaction between the classes, right? Between in the context of the north, at least, between the Sharif and the quote unquote not Sharif. So there's that. I mean, yes, I think the advantage of working on realist progressive fiction is that it's a very good source for the kind of work that anthropologists and sociologists also do, because writers are invested. These writers are invested in depicting reality, particularly social reality. The progressive writers were always about that. So yeah, I hope I've done justice to your questions.
Yes, you have. Thank you so much. Now, my next question is something that I'm deeply interested in. As someone who's doing a PhD, and I'm sure a lot of the scholars who just are in their PhDs or just getting onto the field would be interested in this question, is with regards to how do you access the field, right? And like, how do you make sense of it? How do you organize the archives that you had access to? And you do talk about the generous support you got from the families of these prolific writers. And so, yeah, tell us about, because I mean, field sort of reconstitutes the archive. We all have read debates on archival thinking and reading against the grain, and how an archive is also a field, right? So how do you navigate this published work, but also the unpublished work, the notes, the diaries, scribblings on the margins. I think that's something you write somewhere in the book. The oral narratives that you got by your interactions with these very accomplished children of the writers, some of them who are present today in the conversation. Paintings, for instance, in Jilani Banu Sahiba's case, you write that it was easy for her to communicate or to express through landscapes than through words. First changes later, but with access to such enormous amount of primary resources, if I may say so. Like, how did you as a scholar at that point navigate the field? So yeah, it's a bit broad, but yeah, I mean,
yes, I think Aisha, you may have to narrow this down a little, because there are so many. I mean, this book has, of course, literary analysis, translation, biography, ethnography, history. So I think you may have to narrow down and tell me what specifically it is that you're interested in, so I can tell you how I navigated that aspect.
Sorry, so we can probably look at how challenging was it to translate what you were reading, and to sort of then use it in to sustain academic inquiry, then write it for an academic purpose. Like, how do you deal with translations, for instance?
So the translations of the stories and the essays that you're talking about, right?
And also,
or are you talking about translation figuratively?
No, of the stories, and also the other things that really sort of like enrich the biographies that you write, because you're also going through diaries and notes and letters, and so yeah.
Okay, so let me start with, so the diaries and the letters and all of those things came into, those were really important for the biographies of the writers. So let me talk about, biography, right? And that itself, how that worked, and the field and the archive, as you're saying, in that context. So I think first, it was, I think my work was made very easy by the fact that there was some written material. So I did have a skeletal, kind of beginning, which was easy to define, which I cannot say for the overall, discourse of Hyderabadi women's writings, which was very difficult because it's a very dispersed archive. You don't really know what you're looking for. You don't really know whom you're looking for. But, as far as the biography is concerned, I was very fortunate because, for Jilani Banu, for instance, Jilani Banu wrote two things that were really important. One, she wrote a biographical essay about herself in 1964. And the other, she wrote, there's a more recent book that came out in the 2000s called Main Kaun Hoon. These were really useful in, kind of setting down important, moments in her life and talking about how she felt about them and so on, and what it was like to live through them and experience them. There was that aspect. In the case of Najma Nikhat and Zinat Sajida, for Zinat Sajida, there was a souvenir that had been brought out as part of a celebration, I think, of her life. And this was during her life, and her friends and her students had, put together, these Urdu and English writings. And it contained everything from, nazms that her students had written dedicated to her. And, her friends had written essays about her and so on. That was very useful. Sajjad Shahid, who was her younger son, had written an unpublished biography of his mother, which also contributed to, he very generously shared that, which contributed to the biography that I wrote of her. There was other, kind of prefatory material to her works. I did also talk to, because there were quite a few gaps in all of this. I did talk to both Sajjad Sahab as well as, literary figures from Hyderabad, literary critics, literary scholars, such as Rahmat Yusufzai and, Avdesh Rani Bawa, who knew her, who had been her, quote unquote shagird. They weren't literally her students, but they always talk about, people always talk about Zinat Sajida, as if she was an institution in her own right. And, you kind of, every interaction with her was an education in itself. So I spoke to these people. With them, I mean, if you're getting into the specifics of research, I used a semi-structured interview format, right? So I had these broad prompts that I used. And the rest of it was fairly unstructured because I assumed that there would be things in my own framework, right, which would be limiting and which would not, and there would be things from her life or the way she is remembered, right, by people that would not fall into, the categories of my framework or the kind of or the contours of my or the coordinates of my framework. So I deliberately kept it like that to make sure, and I did manage to get some really interesting insights. With Najma Nikat, it was really interesting because her daughter Homa Qidwai wrote a novel called The Hosseini Alam House, which is a thinly disguised autobiography. I mean, it's a it's her own life, and the character of Nagma Soz in that, a troubled writer who's had a difficult life, very closely mirrors, or if not, almost identically mirrors Najma Nikat's own life. So Najma Nikat also wrote an essay that was very useful, and there was a lot of prefatory material in her, commemorative, in the commemorative volume of her writings that her daughters had published. She also left behind, she was a prolific diarist, so she left behind these 10 diaries in this fine, minute, Urdu writing, which took me days and days to decipher. Which were very instructive about particularly there are these 15 years of her life where she just, kind of vanished from public life when she moved out of Hyderabad, and she, was not able to produce much fiction. But even in that time, she was really prolific because she was producing all these daily entries and diaries, which are quite literary to read at times. So yes, so it was, I don't know if there's anything in particular that you want me to, add in addition to that, but do tell me if I'm missing anything, if I haven't. Yeah.
Nothing. Thank you so much. So I don't know how we're doing for time. Like do we have more time for another question, or should we get Sarah to speak? Because it's already 6:45.
We have another 45 minutes. We're like halfway through, but maybe you want to ask Sarah to speak and then you come back again with another question?
Sure, that we can do that. That'll be great. So if Sarah is ready, hi Sarah, will you please introduce yourself and
my name is Sarah Wahid, and I'm a historian. And I've actually worked also with literature and Urdu literature in particular. I was just in Hyderabad. My family is from Hyderabad, and I'm also from Hyderabad, but I live in the US. So I wanted to, I'm a professor here at University of South Carolina. I wanted to just commend Nazia for this really, really important work. It's just so, so important on many levels. For all of what Aisha had been saying, ranging from the kind of very minimal work that's been done on princely states, ranging from that to thinking about the Deccan and thinking about Dakhni and Urdu and the ways in which this has been fairly marginalized within the broader historiography and seen and rendered quite sort of at the edges of what is India or what is South Asia. And also, I mean, going to the question of gender. So there's so many layers here, right? I mean, there's so many layers of unspoken, what has been unspoken, what has been not articulated, what has been rather overlooked, right? And there's so much we can learn, I think, from sort of peeling back these many different layers of what's hidden from us and what's hidden from really the broader kind of both historiography and literature. And I think that it's really challenging to work with and to situate things in both history and also take seriously the literary voice, and also to take seriously the questions of gender, race, and identity, like religious identity. So there's been just some really wonderful questions here. I also think your work, Nazia, is very commendable from the standpoint of what it might mean for Hyderabadis. I think that I really think that, at least for me, I really welcome this book into the kind of broader discursive production around Hyderabadi-ness, and what it means for women to be a part of that story, because there's a lot of work that has been done, a lot of historical work that has been done on the city of Hyderabad and on the princely state of Hyderabad, right? From a kind of internal, like within Hyderabad itself, right? That circulates within Hyderabad, not necessarily moving out, right? And that in that container, you don't necessarily get to hear these voices of, women. You don't necessarily get to experience the full range of what it means to be Hyderabadi. There's also, of course, all kinds of issues with regards to class differentials and who's writing and who gets to write. And then, of course, yes, and then based on that, whose writing we read. I think that also there might be something worth thinking about in terms of what, when you talked about for instance, someone like Zinat Sajida as an institution in of herself, because in Hyderabad, so many of the institutions and this is something that goes on all over India and broadly South Asia, is just very dominated by men, and that there's a very sort of patriarchal very deep and very strong kind of patriarchal domination of institutions, educational institutions, as well as intellectual traditions. So when we think of who is an intellectual, we never, in the context of Hyderabad or in the context, broadly speaking, and I'm not talking just about within kind of when we're operating between ourselves and the university, of which there are lots of other kinds of questions that get raised, but the broader society, when we think of who is an intellectual, oftentimes, especially in Hyderabad, women are not considered to be doing intellectual work, right? They're not seen as intellectual pioneers or as those who are actually asserting a very important kind of mindful, important work in terms of their place in this society, not just from an experiential point of view, which of course these are all embodied reflections, right? As you were talking about menstruation, childbirth, the ways in which these are being part of the conversation. But again, this question is that they are not rendered as, okay, they're women, they're this other category. They're not seen as doing kind of like real intellectual work. So that's something I think that would be a very major contribution within the context of Hyderabadi society today, which I believe still has a long way to go in sort of really thinking about what it means to be much more inclusive with regards to the voices of women in particular, and women as intellectuals, and women sort of producing intellectual work. And so I just really commend, I think in that way, your work is very path-breaking, both from a historiographical, perspective as well as literary. So I suppose one of the questions I had to do with fiction and autobiography, which is something you mentioned towards the end of when you were talking about, I believe, Nigat, and I think you had mentioned to me in a conversation we had about naming. So there's two sort of questions I have. One is about naming, sort of the ways in which women's names or how they assert themselves through their names and the practices around naming, because oftentimes women will not even be known by their name. They'll be known by, oh, she's someone's sister-in-law, or she's someone's daughter, or she's someone's, mother, right, in these certain contexts. So I'm just sort of curious about naming practices and the name, what it means to be writing in the context of, in the Hyderabadi context, and what it means to be sort of asserting an actual name, like an authorial voice, right? The authorial voice here, I think, is something very important, considering that, of course, this is about these authors, female authors. And then the second question I had to do with fiction and autobiography. And I mean, I've come across this a lot, and it's happens in Urdu, but it also happens in other languages, other Indian languages, which is to say that what is it about women's experiences that makes the writing of autobiography in tension with fiction? Because, I mean, if you look, for instance, at the work of Ismat Jughtai, she's also writing, she writes Tehri Lakir, and she talks about, she writes it as fiction, but it's really based on her own experiences growing up. And so there's this tension. There's other ways in which other writers, who are for some reason not coming to me right now, but who have instrumentalized autobiography through fiction. So what is it about the genre of, say, the novel, or the genre of, other kinds of genres, creative, in terms of sort of creative writing, that enables and allows for a certain kind of a powerful assertion of self that perhaps autobiography doesn't? Or is it that if you put yourself out there in the autobiographical space, in the public space, does that carry with it certain kinds of risks that writing in fiction doesn't? Or is it about really sort of literary devices in these languages? Is it, or, so I would just like to hear from you about that. But I just want to commend you. This is really, really, really important and very path-breaking work, and especially in the Hyderabadi context, especially since, again, like I said, there's a very strong and very male-dominated way in which literary and intellectual work gets done in the city. And of course, this is sort of speaks more broadly to India, but yeah, so thank you so much for that.
Right. Thank you so much. Aisha, can I respond, or do you want to add anything? Is there anything I'm missing by way of protocol? Okay, so while I don't know where Aisha is, so maybe I'll just go ahead. Thank you so much for that generous assessment, Sarah. Let me just I'll start with your question about the naming practices. Yes, I remember sort of talking about my frustration, because when you search through, and this is also, I think, relevant to the question that Aisha asked about method, right? When you search through the archives for women, you need to know, you don't actually know what their names are. If you know, even if you know a specific woman's name, her given name, right? Tayyaba Bilgrami, let's say, you're not going to find her there like that. You have to look for Begum Khadir Jung in order to be able to find her. And I found that so incredibly frustrating, given the role that Tayyaba Bilgrami played as one of the foremost reformers, someone who worked so hard for, the promotion of women's education, the development of women's education, the development of discourses on what a girl's education should be like, why it is important. Her comments on Parda, and they're very controversial at that point. Her and Sughra Humayun Mirza's very controversial statement that, look, you need to relax Parda norms because they're getting in the way of women fulfilling their Islamic duties. I mean, this was, a scandal. So, to find these women, obscured behind a patriarchal name, behind an identity that isn't their own. Being homed and housed in names that are not their own, right? In the shadows of those homes, as it was very, very frustrating. The person who most kind of distinctly challenges this and kind of sets out, the interesting thing is all three writers of mine made my life very easy because they have their own names. So Jilani Bano is, Jilani Bano's own name. It's not a husband's name. It's not a father's name. And, Nivedita Menon has made this argument that why isn't, the father's name also considered a daughter's name, just as, a father's name can be a son's name. But that's another question. Arundhati Roy pointed out in The God of Small Things that what difference does it make? It's a man's name at the end of the day. So I'm not going to go into that, but the person who, and Zinat Sajida as well has her own name. Her name was Zinatun Nisa Sajida Bano, I think. And so it was, her writerly name became Zinat Sajida. And I think that was also that also became her professional name, I think, if I remember, as a professor. But the person who very kind of distinctly challenges this norm and insists on a name that she gives to herself is Najma Nikhat, who named herself, because she said that she was very young. She may have been, I think, an adolescent when she did this. I think her name was Chand Begum, and she said, I don't want this name, and I'm going to be Najma Nikhat. This is what I identify with, and this is who I want to be. And so that was the name that was used in school. That was the name that was used for her when she began to publish and so on. Then I'm kind of very mindful of this, which is why even in the book, I have not tried to do this with academic surnames, because it's just, I'm leaving that as a battle for another day. As I've said in the book, it gets too complicated and perhaps too unwieldy. But at least for the Hyderabadi women, whatever class or religion they're from, I mean, in terms of class, I'm talking mostly about middle class and upper class women, as you pointed out, right? That this is a the moment you talk about texts, it's question of privilege and access to literacy, to writing, all of those things. But yeah, so I've kind of deliberately chosen on a case to kind of determine naming on a case-by-case basis in this book. So with Telugu names, it's women's given names are the ones that I've used, right? And it's easy also with Muslim women's names. So I've used the first name along with Begum, which was a standard form of address. So Tayyiba Bilgrami becomes Tayyiba Begum instead of Bilgrami, right? Which would be again the kind of patriarchal surname. These are again these are not very well developed, entrenched positions that I'm taking at this point. But this is, I think, an attempt on my part to disrupt, the practices, the kind of also Eurocentric, Anglophone practices of the Western Academy that we have to follow, that we follow in Indian publishing as well, of using a surname, right? I mean, so many surnames, for instance, in South India, many women don't use their surnames. Many men don't use their surnames. It's just an initial and you use your first name, right? And there are connotations of caste, and there's so much going on there. So, when we as academics or as researchers write academic books, you have to kind of, adhere to these academic definitions of naming practices, which I'm trying to resist and rebel against. So that's I hope that to some extent deals at least partially with your question on naming practices. As far as fiction and autobiography is concerned, this is so interesting, because I think the person whose work I find most useful and productive in this regard is Siobhan Lambert Hurley, who's written extensively on this. And, she and Anshu Malhotra, excuse me, in one book, I think it's Speaking of the Self, talk about the need to reclaim, because we've been using the term life writing for a very long time. They said, let's reclaim the term autobiography from this, from this canon of white male writers who talk about a sovereign self as opposed to a relational consciousness of self, right? Which is what feminist writers and scholars have argued, that's how women imagine themselves, right? And that's how women perform themselves as well, living in the world as they do. So I think they've said, let's reclaim this and let's expand this idea of the autobiography to include things such as travel writing, such as fiction, and so they've kind of really just kind of thrown that definition out of the water entirely, blown it out of the water. So, what is it about fiction that makes it particularly suitable to autobiography? I mean, I'm thinking in another context of what Veena Das said about the role of fiction. She said that and she was talking about partition experiences. So that's a very different thing, but I think it may be useful for us to understand this. She said some realities need to be fictionalized before they can be apprehended. And I'm just thinking perhaps that articulation of the singular I, right, that sovereign consciousness, is made easier by creative distance. And so perhaps that is why, the novel, or for that matter, even, poetry is, or even travel writing, or even biography. I mean, there are so many scholars who pointed out that Gulbadan Bano Begum's Humayunama is as much, if not more, about her and the women, the Mughal women of her time, as it is about Humayun and the Mughal royal family, right? I mean, the men of that family. So so maybe it just, when you think about autobiography as, a sovereign male consciousness, and women either not seeing themselves in that mold or not being able to articulate that mold very easily, I think it makes a lot of sense when you see them writing fiction, which talks about the self. I hope I've been able to do justice to your questions.
No, I mean, that was wonderful. I mean, that's precisely the distinction I think that needs to be actually appended. And the ways in which what you were talking about with regards to this idea of the sovereign self rather than the relational self, right, is precisely the terrain around which all of this life writing is taking place. And so there's all these ways in which writing in because I mean, when I was writing my book, one of the things I remember looking at was the autobiography of Khurshid Begum, who actually, she's reflecting on Ismat Chughtai's life. At one point, she's even talking about her, she's even talking about this episode that takes place when Angare is published, and there's a big sort of revolt, essentially, by the social kind of the social norms at the time. And what's fascinating is that she writes it much, much later. She writes in the autobiographical mode much later. But if you look at sort of what's happening in the contemporaneous time, it's all fiction, at which point they're sort of expressing their coming of age and so on and so forth. But I think that there's a way in which both the women's writing in terms of genre, how it gets inflected, exactly as you say, in terms of this, because I think that there's a way in which the modern self is very much interpolated as in a very Eurocentric way, and also is interpolated in a very masculinist way. And so there is a kind of consciousness, I think, that needs to be unearthed from all of these different kinds of writing. And I do think that creative and fiction writing does enable and empower the voice of women who otherwise would not have been permitted and or allowed to participate within certain kinds of, many kinds of publics. And I think a lot of also what you're doing is to kind of, in a sense, think of the zenana itself as not just a sort of object, right? Because the zenana has always been seen as an object, as a object that you have to kind of either reform and or either an object that needs to be kind of, it's seen as you touched upon the sort of colonialist vision and the Orientalist vision of the zenana, which gets carried through into a lot of normative mainstream Indian nationalist thinking about women, Muslim women's spaces. And so the zenana is always the object. And it's never rendered as a space from which thinking, thought, activity, life is happening. It's always sort of seen as this dead space, this kind of, silent space. It's rather than a very lively, active, and sort of, I mean, even if you look at the language that's being spoken within and between women. So
there's just to kind of add to your point, this is precisely the idea that people have of the zenana. I mean, Jilani Bano writes in her in Main Kaun Hoon, which is a kind of autobiography, if not memoir. She writes about how when she first began writing, and she wrote extensively about class and gender. There were progressive writers, male progressive writers, who said, who is this, woman in semi-parda? And what does she know about what it means to be a laborer laboring in the fields? As if, a woman living in the Zinana, interacting with working class women, raised by, the daughter of a bonded laborer from Telangana, meeting these working class women and men who go in and out of the house would have no, understanding, living in the Zinana of what social injustice when it comes to class and gender is. So sorry for interrupting. Go ahead.
No, it's precisely around this, the question that this progressive writers, when they're articulating all this turns, right? Because this question of social justice or injustice, right? As the doyens of all things Urdu begin to impose on women who are writing, and they're writing out of the Zinana in proximity to very much those classes of women, perhaps at times in more greater proximity to those class positionalities in some ways. Right. So, I mean, I think that, and so I guess I wonder what it might mean to even sort of theorize sort of life worlds out of the Zinana, rather than see this, again, the Zinana as a space or a place, again, like that gets constantly objectified. And I think that what your work is really doing here is very much pushing back against that, and sort of are really enlivening and enriching our sense of what it means for women to be writing out of those spaces.
All right, great. So sorry, if you don't mind, we'll now proceed to some questions from the audience. Yeah, so we have a question in the chat box, but if we do have any more questions coming in from Facebook or YouTube, I think our moderators will share it with us. But there's one question from Akbar Hassan Saab. I'm wondering who was or is considered Ghair Mulki in the context of Hyderabad. Yeah, I mean, would you be able to tell us a little more about the the Mulki, Ghair Mulki debate that went on?
Right. Yeah. So Salah Chang the First, who was the prime minister and the regent, effectively the regent of Hyderabad state in the mid 19th century, the mid to the late 19th century, did a complete rehaul of the administration and the bureaucracy, right? Because he felt that it was stagnant, which it was. The revenue system was falling apart, and so he wanted trained, skilled professionals to come and people the bureaucracy and the administration. Part of his reforms consisted of this specific migration policy of North Indian, mostly Muslim, some Hindu, as well as Parsi men, and later on, these migrations also included some women in the fields of education and medicine. So I can think of, for instance, Grace Linnell or Constance Gibbs, who also migrated, right? But this early wave these were all middle class recruits, and they brought with them a different understanding of respectability of culture, right? Because they the moment they came in here, the upper class nobility felt very threatened by their presence and their closeness to power, because they were all, as I said, many of them were included in the building of this new bureaucracy. And so, the upper class responded by labeling them non-mulki or ghair mulki. And over a period of time, there used to be something called, a mulki sadaqatnama, which was given to people, as a kind of citizenship of Hyderabad in recognition of their services to the state. So this was a class-based tension by these, between these upper class nobles who felt that, that there were these upstarts who had come in here, with no nobility to their name, with no kind of high birth or, wealth to their name, who had come and were basically, quote unquote, self-made men. And there was a distinct difference in the way Margaret Pennow does a very good job of framing this. These middle class men and women responded to this by developing their own notion of sharafat, which was based on education, which was based on a very austere reformist understanding of religion, right? So there were these tensions on who is a mulki and who is a ghair mulki, and later on as well, there is a, you know, there are the debate kind of shifts and changes. So in the 1920s and 1930s, as a response to the rise in communalism, and the communalizing of the Hyderabadi public space, a group of Hyderabadis of, you know, again, different language communities and religions come together and, you know, start this kind of mulki movement, which, you know, talks about a shared Hyderabadi identity around the question of language and the person of the Nizam. And, you know, after independence, you again have these tensions when the Indian state comes in and, you know, decides to fire a whole bunch of people because they're Muslim, and because you know, and there was a distinct skew in the bureaucracy when it came to Muslims versus Hindus. So to address that, overnight they fired a number of mulki Hyderabadis and replaced them with not only Andhra migrants whose presence was detested and kind of resisted and resented, but also North Indian migrants. So there was a kind of reaction against that. So yeah, so this is a very long kind of debate. I don't know how much water it holds today, given the number of us North Indians and other non-mulkis from South India as well, right? And because Hyderabad is not, Hyderabadis resist both South and North as a kind of definition of who they are. I think they're closer to the South, but the South has also not succeeded in, you know, accommodating them. For instance, the Urdus of the Deccan or the South have not been included in, you know, South Indian literary histories of the South or of the Deccan.
Great. So I'm just going to request the audience, if you have any questions, if you can just type it in the chat box, send it out to us. If you want to ask, you can just probably, I don't know how it works on Zoom, you can raise
you can just turn on your video and you will be seen immediately, and we can just invite you to ask. I mean, it doesn't have to be questions. I'm sure people have lots of interesting things to share, and that's partly the idea, that the book becomes an occasion for sharing. Aparna, do you want to jump in?
I think there's also a question from Akansha Natani. May I take that? Yeah,
sure. And then Aparna would want to come in.
Yeah.
Aparna, just 1 second. I think Nazia wanted to respond to a question, and then you can come in.
Right. I'm just checking if, yeah, okay. So I think Akansha's question is, you know, is some interesting stories or observations from your field work, which you could not talk about in your book. I don't know if, so no, I have talked about these observations, but you know, reading against the grain, that's something that Aisha mentioned early on, that's something that we are kind of trained to do. There were these two moments which helped me, I think, contrary to the way they were intended, contrary to the spirit in which they were intended, which have really contributed to, you know, allowing me to think and theorize about important questions in relation to the visibility and the invisibility of these women writers. One is, and I talk about this in the introduction, this when I very early on, this was during my doctoral work. In fact, I had just read Wajidat Tabassum, and you know, it was just such an eye-opening experience. And I mentioned to a Hyderabadi gentleman whom I had, you know, met in the course of my research, an elderly person who I had met, and I just mentioned to him. He said, "So what are some of the writers that you have read?" And I said, "Well, I've read Wajidat Tabassum." And he said, "Oh, wo to ekdam wahiyat likhti hai." So he kind of actively discouraged me from reading her and said, you know, no, she's not a Hyderabadi writer you should be reading. She's not even a Hyderabadi. She doesn't do justice to Hyderabad. I've seen this trend also amongst other scholars, also amongst scholars. This person was not a scholar. So, you know, who have pointed out, so there have been women scholars who've said, oh, you know, Wajidat Tabassum did not do justice to Hyderabad. She always said bad things about Hyderabad. The editor of Biswi Sadi, which was a journal, once told me that, you know, yeah, we did publish some things about her, but we didn't want to do a lot by her because she was an obscene writer, and we are a family journal. And so that, I mean, this, but to go back to that original moment of, Vahiyat Likhti Hain, that bit, that just got, I think, to be a researcher on women's lives and women's writings, you need to have a nose like a hound. So, so that just got me thinking, I must go back and see what it is about this writer that made this man come out with such a strong reaction. And it turned out predictably that she was talking about female sexuality and caste and solidarity between women of different classes, and class and gender, and caste and gender. And the second moment was when a literary critic from Hyderabad told me, a renowned literary scholar, that Najma Nikhat is a minor writer. Why are you working on her? She only, she produced very few short stories, and many of them are not even, whatever, very good. And the question of canon, the question of a major writer or a minor writer, who decides and under what circumstances, and whether those circumstances and conditions reflect or take into account the realities of women's lives, and the reality in particular of Najma Nikhat's life. Those need to be taken into account when you say that, oh, very few short stories, or some of the stories look very rough, and they look like a kind of draft. So I've not really answered Akansha's question, because these are things that I've dealt with in the book, but I still thought I would draw attention to them to give a sense to people of what it is like to work on women's writings, how you always have to, think tangentially, how you always have to go against the grain. Anant, are we taking a question from Professor Rayapur?
Yeah.
Well, I just want to say how wonderful it is to see, your passion and your work come out in print. Nazia, I've seen you also teach the subject, and it has been quite a journey. I can see that. I have not read the book myself, but I can, also would appreciate this whole work on Hyderabad, which I think, in this sense, from a literary, historical, culture studies lens, but also the ethnographies that probably come to light, and what you were just talking about, the self-reflexive journeys. So yeah, we should have you sometime over to the university. You're right next to, I know, and share this when we have more students on campus. But I'm sure I just wish you all the best, and look forward to reading the book. I'll have something more to say when I actually read it, I'm sure. Thank you. Thank you, Anand.
Thank you so much, Professor Rayapur. I think Sushmita Banerjee has a question.
Yeah, Sushmita Banerjee and then Vindhya Undurti had a question in the chat box. But
oh yes, yeah.
Hi. Yeah, sorry. Hi, can you guys hear me? My internet connection is a bit dodgy, so I'm not going to turn my video on.
Yes, Sushmita, we can hear you.
Yeah. Okay. I've listened to you talk about your work before, and it's fascinating. What was interesting, because I have an interest in literature, is this subterfuge that, and you pointed out, Sarah was pointing it out as well, the subterfuge that fiction, and particularly the choice of genre, allows women, the opportunity to be able to sneak in a part of themselves in some form or the other, which I think is, it's interesting, because, thinking as a person who's interested in the form of cinema, which very quickly, gets delegated as Vahiyat, as enormously present, but so minor in terms of, what one thinks of as high aesthetic value. What I'm curious about is, again, because I'm thinking about cinema on one hand, is what kind of popularity, what kind of circulation does this subterfuge allow? Does this sort of sneaky lightness of hand allow? The fact that they are pretending to not talk about serious issues, does that allow wider circulation? What kind of circulation do these writers enjoying?
should we take a few questions, Nazia, or you want to?
Yes, yeah. So should I do it individually, or should we take some more questions and I just respond to them in one
we
go?
should take 2 or 3 questions at one go, because it's been a long time. So the next second question actually is there in the chat box. India, do you want to ask it by yourself, or should I read it out? Maybe Aisha can just read it. It's there in the chat box.
Yeah, please do.
So,
yeah, Aisha, can you just read it?
All right. So I'm curious to know about what could be the formative influences on these women writers that shape their identities as writers. That's the question India is posting. And we have Navneet Samuel, who's asking if you've read any Arabian feminist authors and any of them inspired you. Perhaps Navneet could also probably specify if he has any particular writers in mind.
Okay, so I think I'll start with Sushmita's question and see what I can do with that in terms of popularity. So the progressive writers in general, Sushmita, were celebrities, right? Because they also read out their work on radio, so they had a much broader circulation. And this is true also of the women writers. So for instance, Najma Nikhat's work, a lot of Zinat Sajida's work was read, in Bombay on radio. Jilani Bano actively wrote radio plays, which alas we have now lost because of the poor archiving that both the radio stations did, as well as these women, right? I mean, there was just it's very frustrating working on them sometimes because they're so poorly documented. Some of them are better documented than others. Zinat Sajida, I think, did not preserve anything that she published on her own. Whatever we have has been published, has been collected, preserved, published by her students or members of her family and other sorts of people. But yes, so they were celebrities in their time. Lots of people knew them. When they traveled, they received invitations from different places, whether it was Delhi or various other places, to speak and to attend gatherings and so on. As for what people made of their this subterfuge of placing their lives in fiction, I don't really know, because I mean we know that the reception of, for instance, Najma Nikhat, who puts a lot of herself and the difficult aspects of her second marriage. There are 2 or 3 stories in particular that I can think of, such as I Barsat, where she discloses the moment of her second husband's betrayal in that story, and how she felt the earth slip from under her feet. And what she thinks of is the first lines that come to her are these lines from a ghazal sung by Begum Akhtar. There's that one. There's another story which talks about her loneliness as this middle class woman who's left alone all day at home, with a largely indifferent husband. By all accounts, I think most people responded very positively to it. She received a lot of fan mail. And I think the subterfuge worked in the sense that it didn't expose her or expose her in any way. I'll have to look more into questions of how these writings were received. Zinat Sajida, for instance, writing about her life experiences in her essay, was widely celebrated, and she was a towering figure. And Sarah spoke about how women intellectuals were not recognized. This woman was really an exception, because she was adored and admired by women and men alike, and she was irresistible. She had a huge personality of her own. So I think elements of the self that would have been there were very well received, and never resulted in any sense of exposure or violation or repercussions for them. I don't know if I'm kind of I know I'm kind of circling around your question, but I will have to think more about it and kind of do a little more research into the way these writings were received. But I don't think I don't think this was ever ever an issue or a crisis for these women as far as, an exposure of the self was concerned. There are also, I think in English writings, in English language writings, women have been a little more circumspect, have been a little more careful. So Huma Kidwai, for instance, insists that her book is a novel, and that is what it is, because those realities are very difficult to talk about in any other mode. So yeah. The other question was, I think, Vindhya's question about formative influences. Yes, so as far as Najma Nikhat is concerned, she did not have a lot of support, and what she made of herself was largely on her own initiative. Zinat Sajida, I think, benefited from the environs of the Osmania University, as well as a family which encouraged her, her creative writing. Right from the time she was a young child of 10, when she wrote, I think it was a play, and her grandfather gave her an Osmani Hali Sikka. So she received a lot of support in that sense. And she had, there was a network of women teachers who also wrote, right, which I'm noticing as something that's not only there in Hyderabad but also there in the north, in places like Lucknow. Because Razia Sajjad Zahir, for instance, played an important role in Fatima Alam Ali's development as a writer, and Fatima Alam Ali is also a Hyderabadi writer. And Jahabano Naqvi, who was Zinat Sajida's teacher, encouraged her as well as other women to write. So there's this very kind of heartwarming network of women supporting each other, and encouraging each other to write. I was talking to Farhan Saab the other day, and he said, he mentioned how Jilani Bano in turn had, mentored a lot of younger women, encouraging them to write and supporting them in their endeavors in various practical and other ways. Jilani Bano came from a very, the family did not have a lot of money, but it was a family that was very rich in terms of things like books, a very, vibrant intellectual and creative atmosphere. She was the daughter of Herat Badayuni, who was a major Persian scholar and also wrote. And so all the siblings, grew up in this environment and had to, because there wasn't a lot of money, had to invent their own games. So they did something which is again very common in families at the time, in middle class families with limited resources. They began their own newsletter and magazine, right? And some of these newsletters and magazines were painstakingly handwritten, single copies, illustrated, full of articles, essays, reviews, news of the day, paintings, all kinds of things that would be circulated in families. So I think those things, her father's tutelage taught Jilani Bano a lot. She was very lucky to receive the support of Makhdoom Mohiuddin, who, told her to ignore these other male progressives who were telling her, oh, what does a woman like her who lives in Parda or semi-Parda know about, the realities of the working class. So Makhdoom just told her to write. He said, don't think about anything else, just write. Ismat Chughtai was another person, so this network of women writers who encouraged Jilani Bano to write and told her when she got married that, don't let this be your destination. Pour into your pen what you would pour into your marriage. So yes, and the last question about, Arab feminist authors. Yes, I mean, Nawal al-Sadawi is, she's a North African writer. But yeah, I mean, from generally writers from the Middle East or writers from North Africa who I think, who I look up to and who've had an influence on my work and whom I also quote in the book. There's Fatima Mernisi, of course. Amina Wadood's work on, and she's a person from another part of the world, but her work on the Quran was very useful for me in understanding and situating Zinat Sajida's, essay on Allah as a woman. So yes, so I think Huma Hodfar and Shireen Ebadi are kind of huge role model figures.
So we have two more questions, and I think We can probably take another one after that. But I'll just read out Asma's question for you. I was wondering if the writers you dealt with the relational aspects of their work. Actually, let me read it from the very beginning. Very warm congratulations on the book, and I really look forward to reading it. I also came in a bit late, so apologies for a question that which may have already been discussed. I was wondering if or how the writers you've dealt with the relational aspects of their worlds, but also commentaries or observations on the larger political issues during which they were writing. I'm sorry, Aruna Bahaguna to please move.
Okay, so I'm just trying to also commentaries and observations on the larger political issues. Yes, well, Najma Nikhat, as I mentioned, was an avowed progressive, and she remained a progressive till the day she died. Never mind the fact that, the death knell of the progressive writers movement was kind of rung in the early 50s. But a lot of these women writers kind of continued to write such things. There's a very interesting aspect of consciousness raising where Najma Nikhat's writing is concerned, particularly her writings on revolution, which I think are inspired by the Telangana struggle of the late 1940s and early 1950s, as well as the Korean War. She has one story which is on the Korean War. She also has a number of stories which deal in a very didactic way with the village economy and the place of class and gender in that. And there's a very clear in the way dialogue between the characters is created. It's very clear that the objective of these stories is to teach and to instruct the reader. So I think that is one. She also has a story on worker strikes, which were really common in the late 1940s and early 1950s in Hyderabad, as a kind of sign of disenchantment with the newly installed Indian regime. Jilani Bano, like I said, has in her novels in particular, but also her short stories. I haven't mentioned her short stories. As Bano got older, right? I would say from the 1980s to the 2000s, her last book is probably her most, the darkest vision that she has when it comes to the world. It's called Rasta Bandh Hai. And it's preoccupied with many things. It's preoccupied by American aggression after 9/11. It's preoccupied by the role of the state, the role of science, the role of communalism, the role of general middle class apathy, which appears to be, in her vision, in this particular book, these things appear to be getting worse and worse. And so, what I really like about this book is that's mirrored not only in the content and the treatment of themes, but also in the treatment of form. So, these so-called stories very often verge on blank verse, and there are also stories which have no narrator, right? Or where the narrator recedes from the background, thereby eliminating the frame that we have to distance ourselves from what is happening in the text. And so, it's in what is happening in the stories. These stories of violence or trauma is in your face, as if she does talk about this in the book itself. She talks about the need for our citizenry to wake up, right? And so this appears to be, an attempt to wake people up and make them think about the role of science and things like the nuclear race, or or other aspects as well, which have been troubling her. And this book came out in 2010. But as I pointed out earlier, so communalism is a major preoccupation of hers. That's something that really worries her. Gender, of course, the larger questions of gender, violence against women. But I think the biggest contribution that she makes is, for me at least, the ones that are the most important to me are in her two novels, in Evan-e Ghazal and Barish-e Sang. Evan-e Ghazal is a wide, broad, epic, scope commentary on major historical, on the events of the transfer of power. And she's talking not only about the political players of Hyderabad and, the people of Hyderabad and the impact this has on them. She holds the political players of Hyderabad to account, and she situates it, situates this history and politics against a larger backdrop of what was happening in the subcontinent, the freedom struggle, things like partition, World War II. So yes, there are other figures that I would also like to, just draw your attention to. I don't know if we have the time to talk about them, but for instance, Jamalunnisa Baji's autobiography, Bikhri Yaadein, is also a very good, example of this engagement of women writers, fiction or non-fiction, with these larger kind of political questions. And there is, I'm trying to see if there is, given that both Zeenat Sajida and Najma Nikhat, Jilani Bano has resisted all her life, all categorizations as progressive or modernist or, anything else. But, these other writers, when it comes to Zeenat Sajida and Najma Nikhat, on Najma Nikhat's part, one finds almost a touching faith in left-wing politics and the Communist Party and, and the progressive writers movement. An almost unquestioning faith, with the exception of one short story, which suggests that, elite maneuvering of subaltern politics is problematic, is bad, and, shows her cynicism and pessimism about that. So I don't know if I've succeeded in answering Asma's question. I hope I have.
Aisha, we have two more questions, I think, in the chat. If we can do those two questions quickly, we should try and wrap up in another 10 minutes or so. I have a few things to say by way of saying thank you to everyone towards the end. So just give me 3-4 minutes for that. And if we can do these two questions quickly, then we can move towards closing.
So yeah, so I'll take these two questions. Ayub Khan writes, looking forward to reading the book. I'm curious if you look at the pre-modern female writers or poets from Deccan as the backstory, women's influence on the development of language, including the coining of new words, also needs a closer look. I'll also just read out Akbar Hassan's, the second question that he's asking. This is a speculative question. Can you speculate on how these women writers would have reacted to socio-political economic realities of modern life? And Aruna would like you to tell us about what you think of Hindustani as a language.
Yeah. Okay, so Ayub's question, no, Ayub, I have not worked on the pre-modern female writers or poets from the Deccan. I think one person you might want to look at, and which you probably would already know about, is Richard Eaton's work on. I think he has a couple of articles on this, on the Chakki Namas and the kind of oral folk, folk songs, village songs that were compiled by Sufi poets, and what we can learn about the development of language and when it comes to women. That's one possibility. Also, Amina Tehseen, who's done some of the most important work on women's writing from Hyderabad in Urdu language research, which we rarely get to see because it's not been translated. Her book on called Hyderabadi, Hyderabad mein Urdu ka Nisai Adab has a chapter specifically on this. So I think that could be something that you may want to look at. This is not really, pre-modern is not really my area, and poetry also is. I mean, I specialize in prose, so I would not venture any further comments on this. As far as Akbar Hassan's question is concerned, this is a speculative question, so my answer will also be speculative. I think Zeenat Sajida would have been very angry and Najma Nikhat would have persisted in her, survivor's way with trying to educate people through her writing. And Jilani Bano, as I've already said, has been justifiably very pessimistic about the direction in which we are heading post-liberalization India onwards, right? I mean, whether it is violence against women or the rise of communalism or the role of the state. She's very critical. This is also very interesting and perhaps a humbling and sobering thought for many of us here. She's very critical about the apathy and the kind of inability of academics to step up, of specifically academic researchers, to step up and kind of do something or address these issues around us more meaningfully. I mean, she speaks about the detachment of scholars and our failure to do as much as we can. So I mean, that's something for us to think about. As far as Aruna Bahugana's question of what I think of Hindustani as a language, I mean, I think Hindustani is what is the common tongue of a lot of North India. I don't know what I can. Again, it's not something that I work on or specialize in. But I think most of us, who are the common tongue, the link language that binds a lot of North Indians is Hindustani. And I mean, if I can, bring this into the realm of something I do understand and can talk about, it would be Dakhani. Dakhani as the common tongue and the link language of people, in the Deccan region, which is distinct from both North India and South India in that sense, is a language which has been, historically marginalized specifically for reasons of power, right? Because of the arrival of the Mughals here and the kind of stripping of cultural capital status from the Dakhani. You now have a version of Urdu that is more North Indian, that you also find these writers using. So as a kind of parting shot, let me tell everyone that the writers I'm working on actually do not use Dakhani. They write in what we would call standard Urdu. I know this is a terribly inadequate response to this question, but perhaps we can discuss this later after the call. Yeah.
Thank you so much, Dr. Nazia Akhtar, for answering all these questions. And I'll over to you, Anand. You can take this forward.
Thank you, everyone. I just wanted to say a few things before we close. It's been a slightly stretched out conversation, but it's really lovely to see everyone being very focused and attentive, and I think that speaks for the value of the book and the way in which the conversation has been actually held until now. So what do I say? Thank you, Nazia, for agreeing to do this. The moment I saw the book being advertised, I jumped on it and said, Nazia, you'll have to do this. And that's because I have been after you for the last many months, asking you to write in other forms. And since that hasn't happened, we have organized another way of bringing you to our conversations. Thank you, Aisha, for agreeing to do this and making the effort to actually get hold of the book. And I'm personally, and you know this, you have actually shared some of your work with me earlier. Really, really looking forward to seeing how your work is going to shape up in your PhD. And thank you, Vanchika, who is actually sitting in Singapore and trying to deal with the ethics review of her field work that is supposed to start later in this year, and also dealing with medical crisis at home, and dealing with a place like Singapore, which is a very nice place in some ways, but also one that can make you feel quite puzzled about where you're sitting. It often feels like you're sitting in a long extended stay in an airport. So thank you, Vanchika, for agreeing to do this. For those of you, and I just received a very urgent message at the beginning from someone saying that Vanchika did not introduce herself. at the beginning. So Vanshika Singh is someone who's very dear to Hyderabad Urban Lab. I mean, many people who work in HUL actually, we're a bit like the Congress party in the sense that, one Congress leader once told me that you don't actually enroll people into to the Congress party. Somebody will have to declare that I don't belong to the Congress party. So it's like that, people just become part of the family, and then you continue like that. So Vanshika was a researcher in Hyderabad for many years, and then she went on to do a PhD, and of course she's going to come back to Hyderabad to do her field work in the next few months. I was hoping that she will show off some of her accomplishments in Urdu, but she refused to do that very flat. She spent quite some time learning Urdu when she was in Hyderabad, and whenever she had a chance to go back to Delhi. I'm also thankful to a lot of people who are here, and since all of us are here, I just want to very quickly underscore a few things that Vanshika said in the beginning, which is the idea of khidki. There are a few things that started happening in Hyderabad Urban Lab in the middle of the pandemic. And in retrospect, when I look at it, I'm quite pleased with the way things have happened. Although at that point of time, they seemed like desperate attempts to stay in touch, to stay warm, to feel that you're connected to things, because even teaching for us, I continued teaching throughout the lockdown. And many times it felt like the frontiers of your learning are the tips of your fingers, your skin, the boundary of your house. The immediate environment becomes the sensorium in which you're learning, right? That's where you're just learning everything from. So in a situation like that, we decided to put together a series of conversations, and the conversations were about how does one belong to something which is not territorial. That's what it essentially was to me, that are there ways in which we can belong to communities which are non-territorial. Those could be linguistic communities that go beyond state formations. Therefore, Telugu doesn't become that formation, except when you involve a whole bunch of diasporic communities. But Dakhni becomes that space of belonging, simply because it is not implicated in any way. I mean, there's no possibility ever of Deccan becoming a state or a subnational entity in India. Right? There are so many memories, there are so many pathways, there are so many directions in which it can take us. And I think that that's where the creative possibilities of thinking about the Deccan actually lie. It gives us a lot of new political pathways. And that means then that it's not about the Deccan itself. It's about, like Vanshika was saying, the Bundelkhand, it's about the Malabar, it's about every single place in India. And there are at least 530 such places, which were all the native ruled states. But I'm just saying that there are so many of these places, and every one of them offers so many different ways in which you can refract your identities. So that's what this is for us, that it's about how to think about places, how to think about belongings. And so in that, there is a particular moment that we have all been very puzzled and confused and trying to think through, which is Hyderabad in the middle of the 20th century. What happened here to people? Because wherever I go across the world, I keep running into people who carry a little bit of what happened in the 50s or 40s. And these are extremely painful memories. There are memories of some kind of a pleasant affiliation. There are very, very real material connections. And I was just thinking when Nazia was just a few moments ago speaking about the Korean War, there are neighborhoods in Hyderabad whose economy depended on war junk from Korea. They purchased material from the Calcutta harbor, from the Chennai harbor, junk that came by ships to these harbors, brought it to Hyderabad and refurbished and produced things out of that. and there are people who remember those details, right? So it's these multiple connections across the world, which I think are very, very important for us to track down, celebrate, figure out how to think about them. So to give it some kind of a shape, we thought that it has to be about writing, but it could then turn into a platform that could produce conversations. We are hoping to curate something together with a group from the Northeast very soon. The book events, which is inaugurated with Nazia's book, I'm sure is going to continue, because there's so many other books that we are thinking about that we should bring into conversations here. So this is what it is. It's about celebrating friendship. It's about sharing pain. It's about sharing ideas. That's what Khidki is all about. It's a provisional opening, and we should use it as well as we can. So thank you so much for being here, and we will stay in touch. We will keep you posted about where we're all going. Yeah, thank you so much. Akbar Saab, yes, of course, we'll keep you all posted about when the next sessions on the books will be. There is actually already in this room Sarah Waheed, whose book on Urdu writing in Pakistan and India, which progressive Urdu writing in Pakistan and India, which is very, very important work that we need to think through. So that is, to my mind, going to be the next book discussion that's going to happen. Maybe in another month or so, we will announce all of this. Thank you, Shiva, Swati, for posting that. I'm really glad to see you here. You know, despite the fact that you've been a bit unwell. Actually, there's so many people who told me just this morning that they were unwell. They're all here, which is a nice warm feeling. Thank you very much.